Morning, everyone, and welcome to our 12th BC Poultry Symposium webinar. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and a big thank you to all of our sponsors as well. Today, we have Dr. Ken Bafundo from Phibro Animal Health presenting on the use of Magni Phi in today's broiler chickens. Dr. Bafundo has a Master's of Science in Parasitology and Microbiology from Memphis State University. He holds a PhD in poultry nutrition from the University of Illinois. He has been involved in global product development activities for poultry products for over 35 years. While working for either Elanco, Pfizer, or Phibro Animal Health, he has conducted research on coccidiosis, various anticoccidials, coccidiosis vaccines, antibiotics, and natural products of plant origin. We do have Dr. Bafundo's permission to record and post this webinar, so it will be available to view at a later date on our website as well. We will likely have some time for questions after the presentation, so please feel free to type them into the chat box as we go along, and we will go through them time permitting. Okay, so with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Ken Bafundo.
Thank you, Lindsay. Can you hear me okay? Everything good as far as that goes?
Yes, everything's fine, Doctor.
Okay. Well, good. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're in the East like I am. So today I'd like to share with you some of the research that we have been doing over the last 5 or 6 years on a product that we have developed called Magni Phi. So I'm going to jump right into the scenario here that that we have worked with in the United States for about 7 years or so now. Okay, about 7 years ago, the industry made the joint decision that they were going to eliminate the use of antibiotics. This was pretty much proposed by the FDA, but there is no really formal banning of antibiotics in the United States. It's simply a consumer choice to eliminate these products from standard feeding programs. So we still have a wide variety of different programs from which a producer can use various products in the United States. So if you look at some of the categories that we have, just full spectrum use where all of the approved FDA approved products can be used, reduced use, which is limiting the use of certain antibiotics to products such as avilamycin, bacitracin, and bambamycin. We also have a category where ionophores only can be used, and then we have the equivalent of your RWA, I believe, which is the NAE production, where no antibiotics of any type can be used. Okay, so if you look at this graphic and you follow the green bar, if you will, you can see that beginning in about 2016, this actually originated probably about 2013 or so. But beginning in about 2016, we saw a fairly significant increase in the numbers of broilers that were reared under NAE types of programs. Okay, and you can see that this peaked in about 2019 with nearly 60% of the broilers in the U.S. Being raised under NAE types of production systems. Okay, so over the last 4 to 5 years in particular, I think the significance of NAE, no antibiotics ever, has become one of the major driving factors in U.S. production. Okay, now I think it's important that we point out that that this peaked in 2019. Okay, and we saw a decrease in numbers of broilers that were raised under these types of programs in 2020, and soon we will get data on 2021. Another couple of weeks we should probably have some indicator data of what 2021 looks like. if you look at that trend, that is that it seems to be dropping off a bit. My personal feeling is I think this is going to continue. It is going to decrease a little bit more. Part of the reason for that, I think, is perhaps two reasons for that. And one of which may be that the market for totally antibiotic-free chicken, for NAE chicken, is likely to be saturated. And because of the costs associated with raising NAE chicken, many producers are decreasing the numbers of birds in that category. And that's also reflected by an increase in the numbers of programs that we see where ionophores are being fed. If you look at the 2019 to 2020 trend, you see that the numbers of broilers raised using ionophores has actually increased. I also anticipate that category to increase slightly. I may be guessing, or maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, but really my personal feeling is that that category will likely increase further. And that may be indicative not only of changes in saturation of NAE chicken, but may also indicate the difficulties associated as far as coccidiosis are concerned that are brought about under the scenarios brought about by NAE production. Okay, and I think it's logical to assume that in the absence of any meaningful antibiotics, and by that I mean the ionophores, coccidiosis continues to be a very significant issue under the conditions, under the NAE types of production conditions. Okay, so on this next slide, what I've got is a group of chemical products that are used in place of, or actually in place of ionophores, but have been the primary products that are used when anticoccidial therapies are used for controlling coccidiosis. And if you just look at these products, you know that over the history of their lives, and all of these products are old, over the history of these products, they have been plagued with resistance issues. And I think one of the one exception to that is perhaps nicarbazine, but all of these products have been plagued with resistance issues, among other shortcomings that they may have. Okay, so I think to kind of set the scenario here, these products have been used in the U.S. industry as really the major products for control of coccidiosis for about 6 or 7 years now. Okay, recently we conducted a series of sensitivity studies on coccidia that we collected from the U.S. It should be no surprise to anybody that we have seen widespread resistance among field coccidia to the majority of these products. That's going to be the subject of another seminar, or perhaps some other papers that we present this winter. But I think under the scenarios that are created with NAE types of production systems, we see difficulties with coccidiosis. And I think it should be evident, it should not be a surprise to anyone that the difficulties that we see with coccidiosis are really brought about by some of the products that are used here. They just do not have the resilience that the ionophores do. Okay. The other factor to consider at the bottom of the chart is the fact that coccidiosis vaccines are widely used. Probably 50% of the broilers reared in the United States are vaccinated for coccidiosis. So under these scenarios where we have growing resistance to chemical anticoccidials, we have widespread use of coccidiosis vaccines. We know that intestinal health is a major issue for broiler production. And if you talk to any of the major broiler producers, talk to the veterinary teams associated with these groups, they readily admit that there are difficulties associated with coccidiosis control under NAE types of production systems. Okay, so this has this scenario in general has allowed many alternative types of products to enter the marketplace and to try to assist in solving this major issue. So my talk today is about one of those products. It's about Magni Phi. And Magni Phi has been used over the last 6 years in the United States to offset some of the difficulties that I've just described. That is, growing concerns about coccidia and the significance of coccidiosis in broiler production under U.S. growing conditions. Okay, so a couple of basics about Magni Phi before I jump into some of the data that we have generated over the years. The active ingredients in Magni Phi are saponins. Saponins are natural surfactants that are found in many, many plants. They are natural products, natural surfactants. Among those with the greatest activity and application in animal feeding are two that certainly you may be familiar with. Yucca shedidra. Yucca is fairly commonly used in a number of different animal production types of scenarios for a number of different applications. But there's also another significant saponin, which is really the driving factor behind the activity of Magni Phi, and that is Chelia saponaria. So I'll give you a quick outline of some of these products. So yucca, again, fairly commonly used in animal production systems. The active ingredients in yucca are steroidal saponins. They have a general chemical structure like the one laid out here. Yucca is raised in plants. The picture here on the left is a photograph of a yucca plant that is being raised in, this is a natural plant that is raised in Mexico, the Baja Peninsula of Mexico. And then we have Chelia saponaria, which is actually a tree. And the saponins that are taken from the Chelia tree are classified as triterpenoid saponins, and they have a different chemical structure. So there is an ideal ratio of these two saponins that are contained in Magni Phi. Again, the driving factor behind the biological activity of this product is Chelia saponaria and the triterpenoid saponins that are presented here. Okay. So if you go into the literature and do some research on the biological activities of saponins, and these papers have been published long before I started playing around with these products, but you can find references on antiprotozoal activity against a number of different protozoal organisms. You can find references on improved immunity, primarily in mammalian species, and the Chelia saponins in particular are well known as being adjuvants that are used in a variety of different types of vaccines. So they do have the ability to facilitate stimulation of the immune response. Likewise, Chelia saponins are also known to facilitate absorption and to produce a variety of intestinal effects. Okay? Quite interestingly, these products are very safe. If you've ever drink Coca-Cola or Coca-Cola products, these products are contained, or these saponins are contained in Coca-Cola products because they facilitate foaming, that is bubbling up of the Coca-Cola when it's poured into a glass. Okay, so many of us have consumed these products, so I think it's all safe to conclude that they are safe when used in animal species. Okay, so a quick summary. We've been doing research on the yucca-chelea combination for about 7 years. So some of the things that we have learned in the course of doing that research is that the saponins have the ability to impair the development of Mymeria species in broilers and in turkeys. They reduce some of the negative effects of coccidiosis on growth of broilers and turkeys. They enhance performance of coccidiosis vaccines and also of some of the chemical and ionophore anticoccidials that are used to control coccidiosis. One of the things that we discovered in the process of doing this work was there is also some effects on bacterial populations. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. But this kind of took us by surprise. We learned a lot in the course of doing this, and they have the ability to reduce mortality in high disease challenge environments. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the other effects that we have measured, some of the work that we have done. Okay, so one of the areas where Magni Phi has proven to be very successful in the U.S. industry and likewise in other parts of the world now is when it's combined with the use of coccidiosis vaccines. And some of the work that we have done has really focused on trying to understand this process better and what we actually measure when we put Magni Phi in combination with birds that have been vaccinated for coccidiosis. So some of the previous work that we did, which I've skipped over, is that we see reduction in oocyst production when Magni Phi is fed to broilers. Generally, it's about a 50% reduction in oocyst produced. And we see some reduction in lesion scores as well. Generally, it's about 25 to 40% reduction. My feeling is that the reduction in oocyst numbers is a far more indicative measurement when you're trying to evaluate these than lesion scores. Lesion scores can be by nature pretty variable, so I found more reliability when we actually do OPG assessments rather than lesion scores. It's also been shown to improve the performance of ionophores and coccidiosis vaccination programs in many pen studies that we have conducted. So I'm going to jump into 2 studies that we have conducted on this to give you an example of the type of work that we have done. We wanted to determine what the effects of Magni Phi were in broilers vaccinated for coccidiosis and whether Magni Phi improves performance responses of these birds. So we really, it's just a pretty simple experimental design. Magni Phi at 2 doses, 0 and 250 ppm in birds that were not or vaccinated for coccidiosis using Coccivac B in this particular study. Okay, so again, this was kind of a pilot study, or a group of pilot studies that we put together back at the start of this program. We simply wanted to measure oocyst production at day 21, which is kind of a critical point at which you know, some of the negative effects of coccidial vaccinations start to manifest themselves. So we saw that in birds that received the vaccine without Magni Phi, that is the blue bar, you know, there's, in this particular group of studies, there was about 12,000 oocysts per gram of feces. And what we saw was a significant reduction down to about 4,000 oocysts per gram. So this is kind of consistent with what we had observed in other studies that we had conducted at this point in time. And then we were able to measure body weights at 28 days and feed conversion at the same time period. And these are trends. These are not significant responses in these at this particular point in time. but you can see that the trends are starting to manifest themselves at this date. But by the time we reached 42 days of body weight, the birds that were receiving Magni Phi had significantly improved body weight gains and feed conversions at the end of the study. So this kind of gave us some indication that Magni Phi could be effectively used in combination with coccidiosis vaccines. You know, to be honest, I think one of the major uses that Magni Phi has in U.S. production has been to support the use of coccidiosis vaccination. As I said, you know, there are large numbers of broilers that are vaccinated for coccidiosis under U.S. conditions. It's somewhere around 50% of the broilers produced. So a major portion of that involves the use of Magni Phi with it. So this is another example of the type of work that we did with Magni Phi in birds vaccinated for coccidiosis. We wanted to determine what was the ideal timing for Magni Phi usage. That is it best in starter feeds? Is it best in grower feeds? Is it best when fed throughout in birds that were vaccinated for coccidia? So this is a similar type of study to what I just reported. But if you look at the way I'm going to present these data is if you look at treatments 2 and 4, okay, both of these groups, 2 and 4, were given Magni Phi from 0 to 28 days of age. Okay, and then treatments 1 and 3 did not receive Magni Phi. Did not receive Magni Phi until later in the grow out. So we were able to pool the two treatments, that is 2 and 4 were compared to 1 and 3. Okay, so that's what we see here. Birds that received Magni Phi again showed about a 50% reduction in oocysts produced, both at 21 and 28 days of age. And I think, again, these are kind of critical time points when some of the negative effects of coccidiosis vaccination are known to occur. Okay, but when we look at feed conversion at 28 days, again, we saw that that Magni Phi improved feed conversion at that time point. And here are the 4 treatments that are broken out at day 42. We can see that birds that were vaccinated alone, that is the blue bar, and birds that received Magni Phi at different time periods, that is from 0 to 28 days or 29 to 42 days, showed significant improvements compared to the vaccine alone. But when Magni Phi was administered throughout the cycle, we saw the best feed conversions that was significantly better than all of the other treatments. So this kind of gave us some indication that in birds that are vaccinated for coccidiosis, the significance of Magni Phi seems to manifest itself pretty much throughout the grow out. So what I've shown you here in the first couple of studies, these were some of the preliminary studies that we have done on coccidiosis vaccination. You know, they go back in about 6 years in time. Since that point, we have done a number of other studies, and I've summarized for you using meta-analysis the results of 15 different floor pen trials that we conducted from 2017 to 2020, dealing with coccidiosis vaccination. A wide variety of challenge conditions were used, and we were able to make very simple determinations or very simple comparisons between birds that were vaccinated for coccidiosis and birds that were vaccinated for coccidiosis and administered Magni Phi. So we've got a lot of replications here. This is a meta-analysis. It's 164 replications from 15 different studies that we looked at. And these are just the performance variables that we're able to demonstrate. So you can see body weight gain responses going across the chart. these are big numbers. It's about 100 grams difference in birds that were fed Magni Phi, and about 5 points in feed conversion in these 15 different trials. I think the other thing that got our attention here is that we saw very significant changes in mortality. And I think again, under the conditions that these trials were conducted, where there's a high disease challenge with a variety of different types of pathogens, these are the types of responses that we got under those scenarios. Okay, so just a quick summary on this part of the presentation, I think, is the saponins and Magni Phi exert anticoccidial properties. Obviously on oocyst production and reduction in lesion scores, we see good results when combined with coccidiosis vaccines. I'm going to show you some information on chemicals here in just a minute. Okay, but so this is a different series of studies that we conducted where we wanted to evaluate the effects of Magni Phi in combination with a number of different types of chemical anticoccidials that are commonly used in the NAE scenario in the US. Okay, so again, these are high challenge environments. Eastern shore of Maryland, known to be a pretty high challenge situation. We wanted to evaluate these different types of programs. Okay. We had a control group, obviously, that received no medication. Nicarb was one of the products that we evaluated. And we use in the US a step-down program with nicarbazine, where we start at 125 ppm and drop it down to 100 ppm and feed that to 28 days. The third treatment is that same treatment with nicarb with Magni Phi added to it. Fourth treatment is a Magni Phi Decox shuttle program. Again, Decox being one of the chemical anticoccidials that is commonly used. Fifth is that same program with Magni Phi. We threw in Coxivac as a non-chemical comparison here. And then we also added in just a couple of days before the trial started, the treatment Zoeline, which is the most commonly used chemical under US conditions. Okay, and then we added that Zoeline treatment. We added Magni Phi to it. So this is just going to focus on lesion scores. If you looked at comparative lesion scores at day 21, you can see that the control treatments had these are duodenal lesion scores. Control treatments were 2.7, and with each of the successive treatments, coccidiosis vaccine, Zoeline, Nicarb Decox, and Nicarb, you see gradual reduction in the severity of the acerbulina lesions that we measured. But note that with each group that received Magni Phi, there is a significant reduction compared to its corresponding chemical control. Okay, so even in the presence of some of these chemical anticoccidials, we see Magni Phi exerting a positive effect on control of coccidiosis. Same thing's true when we looked at Eimeria maxima lesions. And just as it was with the acerbulina lesions, I think what we see in this situation is the four programs with the lowest lesion scores all contains Magni Phi. So Magni Phi is helping not only coccidiosis vaccines, but it also helps chemical anticoccidials do a better job. And I think given the scenario that we have where we are relying heavily on these chemical anticoccidials to carry the freight, I think this is an important point to make. Okay. So for the first couple of years that we worked with Magni Phi, we put a lot of emphasis on coccidiosis control. And I think, given the scenario that we were in, where we had taken ionophores and growth promoting antibiotics out of the feet pretty much simultaneously. All that occurred within about a 3-month time period. Coccidiosis was an issue, continues to be an issue, but I think under that scenario, we placed a lot of emphasis on coccidiosis control. But I think as time went on, what we actually were able to observe, and our customers led us in this direction in many situations, is that they reported to us that other positive benefits were taking place. And they asked us to produce data which would help them understand what was actually taking place. So this second part of this presentation, I think, is an effort to understand better some of the other things that are going on in the gut. Okay, so in about 2017, 2018, we started work on evaluating the effects of Magni Phi on nutrient digestibility. And early in the presentation, I mentioned to you that there are some preliminary publications which suggested that absorption of certain materials from the gut is affected by Chelia saponins. So we kind of took on this little project to understand digestibility a little bit better. Okay, so these studies were actually conducted in Europe under European growing conditions. And I might add that there's no disease challenge in these studies at all. These assessments were done in birds that are completely healthy. We tried to maintain this facility as disease-free as possible. Okay, so we set up a floor pen study with 3 doses of Magni Phi, 0, 250, and 500 ppm. And then on the 21st day of that study, we took 2 birds from each pen, and there were 8 replicate pens for each treatment. We took 2 birds from and moved them to metabolism cages, fed them the same diets, and started collecting feces so that we could measure apparent total tract digestibility. So the results here are based on a small number of birds, a small number of healthy birds that were raised primarily in metabolism cages. So this is a floor pen study. So these are the results of the floor pen study. And note that, again, these are birds that have not been challenged with any disease organisms. But even in the absence of disease organisms, we see that Magni Phi has a positive effect on body weights and on feed conversions. But I think the important thing for us in these was when we started to pick up differences as far as nitrogen retention, okay, crude protein measured as nitrogen retention, digestibility of crude fat, and on the next slide we have crude ash, which is a reflection of mineral digestibility. And there's also one other measurement that we made, and that's calcium digestibility in these studies. So the trends are all very positive. In most cases, these trends are statistically significant. So it kind of supports the original papers that were presented on Chelia saponins as being capable of facilitating uptake and utilization of nutrients more effectively. So at least in this scenario, I think this was kind of a major breakthrough for us. And as we started to understand that in addition to having some anti-coccidial benefits, that Magni Phi is actually producing some benefits as far as the intestine is concerned. So I think this could account for some of the growth differences that we see between non-medicated and treated and Magni Phi treated flocks. So it's been very significant as far as our understanding of the product is concerned. I think the other thing that our customers asked us to take a look at was one of the reports that we received during the use of Magni Phi was mortality is decreasing. And again, keep in mind that in the environment that we had used the product, we had recently taken ionophores and antibiotics out of the feed. And as a result of that, there were increases in mortality. When birds were fed Magni Phi in those scenarios, what was reported to us was there's lower levels of mortality. Or another way to say that is we're treating fewer flocks for bacterial complications. Can you help us understand what's happening? Okay. And to be honest, we hadn't thought about any of these types of effects while we did the initial work on Magni Phi. So we were, at first we were perplexed. I was a non-believer, I suppose. But as the more I heard these requests, the more people I talked to about this, the more we realized that there had to be something that we needed to investigate here. So much of this was brought about by simply us not knowing the answers to questions that our customers were asking us. Okay. So we decided to do a series of trials under a multi-disease challenge type of an environment. These trials were conducted over a 2-year time period under a fairly high disease challenge. Again, we used 0, 250, and 500 ppm. All of these birds were vaccinated for coccidiosis using Coccivac B52. We created intentionally a disease challenge where we seeded the litter with Clostridium perfringens with a number of different Salmonella serotypes. And we also added coccidiosis to the mix as well. Okay, so our intention in these studies was to produce a fairly high level of mortality. What we were after was 8 to 10% mortality in these trials. Okay. We also made carcass yield evaluations, and these were some of the first times we ever evaluated carcass yield with this product. Okay. So we did some bacterial evaluations, and I'm going to save us a bunch of time to tell you and explaining all of the techniques that we used. But we used standard techniques to evaluate both Clostridia and Salmonella in intestinal tracts. And we used specific media where we enriched the growth of these various organisms so that we could make evaluations on whether these birds were positive or negative for Salmonella, or whether or not we could make estimates of numbers of Clostridia per gram of feces. Okay. So under these high challenge conditions, what we tried to do was, again, produce a fairly high level of mortality. In this case, over on the right, you can see that the control groups, which were vaccinated for coccidiosis and exposed to all of those different pathogens in the litter, had about 10% mortality. So we pretty much achieved what we wanted to. And then when we added Magni Phi at either 250 or 500 ppm, we see that the mortality decreased in a linear fashion. Okay. We also saw nice improvements in body weight and feed conversion. So we had pretty much met the requirements that we had established, that is, producing a high disease challenge under the conditions of the study. Okay. On the left here are the coccidial lesion scores that we measured over the course of these 4 studies. And these are consistent with the lesion scores I've already shown you in other studies that we have evaluated. Okay. When we put Magni Phi in combination with a coccidiosis vaccine, as is B52, these are the types of reductions that we typically see. But when we counted C. perfringens in per gram of fecal material that we collected, okay, we actually see a very nice reduction in numbers of Clostridia that are being passed into feces. Okay, so these are logarithmic expressions. You know, I took the anti-log of all of these numbers, and it's about 20,000 in the control group down to about 5 to 8,000 in the treated groups. So it's not an effect measured like an antibiotic would produce, but nonetheless there is a significant reduction in numbers of Clostridia in feces when we made these assessments. Okay, and this is both at 21 and 42 days of age. So that helped us at least explain in part why we saw a decrease in mortality. Fewer Clostridia, obviously fewer complications associated with necrotic enteritis. And these are consistent with results that were being reported to us from veterinarians in various companies around the U.S. So then we measured also salmonella, and this is the incidence of salmonella. So the technique that we used was simply taking 4 birds per pen and using the procedures that I described to you to evaluate 1 gram of intestinal contents for the presence of any salmonella organism. Okay, and if it was, and you know, they were each of these samples was enriched and monitored over an incubation period of 3 days on the appropriate agar to be sure that we had tried to maximize any growth amongst the organisms that could be there. Okay, so control groups have about 70% positives. That is, of 4 birds per pen, if 1 bird is positive, that would be, for that pen, that would be a score of 25%. If 4 birds were positive, that would be 100 for that particular pen. So these are the results using that technique of 4 different trials. About 70% in the controls. You can see that there's a significant linear reduction. Again, we're not eliminating salmonella by any means, but we do see that there is an effect on these bacteria at various doses of Magni Phi usage. So I think one of the important things that's come out of this work is that we have actually used this as kind of a springboard to use Magni Phi as means of promoting promoting the effects of certain multi-species probiotics. Okay, and we are using Magni Phi in combination with multi-species antibiotics to have a much greater effect on salmonella than is presented here. So that type of research and those types of applications are currently being evaluated not only in our studies, but also under field conditions that we have here in the U.S. And so far, those results are very, very, very informative and very, very encouraging as far as what could be done as far as decreasing salmonella challenges. So we're on the trail of that here. Okay, so we've also got we've also done a fair amount of work assessing carcass yield, and this was kind of an outcropping of some of the digestibility work that we did that I presented earlier. As part of these studies where we evaluated Magni Phi under high disease challenge, we had the opportunity to make some of the initial assessments on carcass yield. So again, this is a 4-trial pooled analysis where we looked at carcass characteristics on 50 reps per treatment, where we looked at 10 birds per replication. So that's 500 birds per treatment that we were able to evaluate. So these are the performance data that I showed you a few minutes ago. Again, improvements in feed conversion and body weight gain. Bigger birds are going to yield a little bit better, so that's a factor that we have to consider here. But when we looked at whole carcass yield, this would be hot carcass yield, obviously, we saw a very nice linear improvement in total carcass yield prior to chilling. So again, this was some of the first work that we did in that particular area. Okay. As a follow-up to that, we took the data that I just showed you and presented it to one of our customers in Texas. They were very interested in that. They conducted their own studies on Magni Phi and carcass yield. Okay, so these are data that were conducted by and prepared by one of our customers in the U.S. market. Okay, so you can see the way they evaluate carcass yield for them is very different than the way that we have done it. They look at it as front half, breast, tenders, and total white meat produced, and this is by weight expressed in kilograms at day 49. Our studies were done at day 42. Okay. So you can see that in the situation that they conducted in their conditions, their diets, they also saw significant improvements in carcass yield with Magni Phi. Okay. They also expressed it as a percent of live weight, which for them I think was a very important way of expressing the data that they produced, and they showed the same types of trends. So same types of significant responses as in all of the variables that they measured. Okay. So we have more work going on in this area, and this is one of the more active areas of research on this product right now. So kind of moving to the end of my presentation here. Magni Phi in the broiler chicken does a number of different things. You know, we've demonstrated that there's a reduced level of intestinal disease. That started with some of our work with coccidiosis. It's continued and continues with our efforts to understand effects on Clostridia and Salmonella and potentially other bacteria in the intestinal tract. We demonstrated that by reducing the level of intestinal disease, we also see improved whole tract digestibility improve. So we know that Magni Phi has an effect on uptake and utilization of nutrients. And as a result of that, performance improves. And when performance improves, normally we see improved carcass yield. So that kind of cascade of events is kind of how we have envisioned some of the explanations associated with some of the effects of Magni Phi on carcass yield. So, so kind of a summary here is we started on this as a project to facilitate the control of coccidia. And this goes back 6 or 7 years in research history, if you will, where we tried to get a better understanding of what Magni Phi would do as far as managing coccidial challenges, use with different types of anti-coccidial methodologies, coccidiosis vaccines, ionophores, chemicals, etc. Okay. But as we have progressed and you know, the work that we're currently doing now is really focused on understanding Magni Phi as a means of improving the health of the intestinal tract. And some of the questions that we're asking ourselves now are, you know, we've seen lower mortalities, we've seen lower bacterial counts, we've seen improved digestibility, better performance, and enhanced carcass traits. A lot of our attention right now is focused on some of the responses that we see as far as Clostridia and Salmonella are concerned. While we're still very much interested in the coccidial aspects of what Magni Phi does, you know, there's a great deal of interest in some of these responses as far as Salmonella is concerned. And as I mentioned earlier, when we take Magni Phi and combine it with a multi-species probiotic, we see some fairly significant changes in numbers of Salmonella and Salmonella contamination. So that's kind of where the next part of this this research program will go. But I think for today, I think I've talked for about 45 minutes, so maybe I can stop now and hopefully answer some questions that you may have. But thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bafundo. That was really interesting. I do see one question here. It says, Ken, have you performed any histological analysis of intestinal sections during your studies, particularly quantitating reductions in inflammation, coccidial invasion, and bacterial adhesion or presence?
The answer to that is yes. Some of that work is underway, but we have also completed some of it already. We do see reductions in inflammation. That's something that has been documented, both with Chelia saponins and likewise with Yucca saponins. So we know that there is a reduction in the inflammatory response associated with use of these products. We have not done any work, to my knowledge, on adhesion of certain bacteria, but we are looking very closely at the effects of Magni Phi on some of these, particularly the salmonella organisms that I've talked about. You know, to be honest, I think, you know, when we first started picking up these differences in bacterial numbers and fecal counts of Clostridia, et cetera, we were surprised. I mean, we didn't expect these types of responses to occur. And because what's in the literature on the antimicrobial effects of saponins is number one, it's not very complete. There are major gaps in our understanding of what could be taking place. But also we just didn't believe that there would be any antibacterial effects or any changes in bacterial numbers. We've done this enough now under a number of different environmental conditions that we feel fairly certain that, you know, what we're measuring is accurate. What I haven't mentioned here is because I don't want to be too predictive, I suppose. Well, we have started to measure changes in the microbiome associated with feeding of Magni Phi, and we do see significant changes in certain groups of bacteria that could in fact be influencing the numbers of Clostridia and or the numbers of salmonella that are present. Some of the organisms that seem to proliferate in the presence of Magni Phi are those organisms that produce natural antibiotics. So there could be, and we've got work going on right now in this area, but we're trying to make assessments of how common those particular types of bacteria are and the amounts of natural antibiotics that could be promoted in those types of situations. So, you know, me being pretty standard nutritionist, that's beyond my job description. So I'm letting some other people do that kind of work. But I think that there's some pretty exciting stuff that we've got going on with this.
Interesting.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah,
really is.
I do have a couple more questions here. The next one, has Magni Phi been fed in long-lived birds?
Yes. So we have studies underway, and we have completed some studies in laying table egg layers that have been fed right now. We're probably at about 38 weeks of feeding. Okay. So one of the things that we observed in this, this was kind of the thing that caught our attention, was that particularly during the rearing period, we saw better uniformity in birds that were fed Magni Phi. So it makes sense if we're decreasing the challenge of coccidiosis. Coccidia have a tremendous effect on uniformity and overall body size. If we're doing that, then it follows that uniformity would increase. One of our large customers in the U.S. has conducted a very large study in broiler breeders, where they have evaluated uniformity and observed significant improvements in pullet uniformity during Magni Phi feeding. So this work continues. We've got studies going on in Southeast Asia where we're looking at more elaborate types of evaluations in egg layers, so that we have better understanding of what Magni Phi is doing as far as the layer itself, and likewise to the quality of the egg. One of the things that got my attention was that calcium digestibility data that I briefly mentioned. That has been confirmed by one of the egg producers in Southeast Asia, who observed not only better calcium utilization, but greater shell thickness and greater shell strength, both of which are really kind of interesting. So there's lots of stuff that we have to be following up on. You know, so you know, there's some really interesting things here.
Yes, absolutely. I think I have time for one more question here, and you have touched on this a little bit regarding salmonella, but the next question here is asking about any effect on bacteria like E. coli, MG, or MS.
We have some data on E. coli, and I promised one of my Canadian colleagues that I would summarize that data on E. coli. I have not done that. Okay, so I'm deficient in that area. So we have the data, I just have not summarized it. So rather than tell you this is what happens, I'm going to have to hold that off to the next time we have a discussion on this. I apologize, but we do have it. One of the things about saponins is that they're pretty much confined to the intestinal tract. So we don't anticipate Magni Phi having any effects on respiratory infections or any other type of extra intestinal bacterial issue. So don't think mycoplasma would really fit the need here, or fit the
Yes, that makes sense. Well, we're going to have you back at another time, because there are, you know, a few more really great questions here, and it sounds like, you know, lots more to discuss about, you know, coccidiosis, gut health, and the use of Magni Phi. So for now, though, I want to thank you again, Dr. Bafundo. We really appreciate your time and expertise today, and thank you again as well to all of our sponsors. Our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, November 17th, and we will cover vaccination against necrotic enteritis due to Clostridium perfringens type A, presented by Dr. Kirsten de Keyser from Huvepharma Canada. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bafundo. Take care, and we hope you can join us again next month.